The brief and harrowing reign of Lady Jane Grey, lasting a mere 9 days, stands as a chilling testament to the fragility of power and the brutal machinations that defined Tudor succession. A young girl thrust unwillingly into the deadly vortex of political ambition and dynastic scheming, Jane's ascent to the throne was less a coronation than a calculated gambit by those who sought to manipulate the fragile threads of legitimacy. Her fleeting moment as queen, suffused with an innocence ill-suited to the ruthless demands of monarchy, set the stage for a tragic denouement steeped in psychological torment and political cruelty. Lady Jane Grey was no ordinary claimant. Born into nobility, her education was rigorous, her intellect sharp, qualities that, paradoxically, rendered her both a pawn and a potential threat in the eyes of the Tudor elite. Her lineage, intertwined with the royal bloodline, made her a figure of dangerous possibility in a kingdom fractured by religious and political tensions. Yet, the young woman who found herself crowned was a tragic emblem of youthful innocence ensnared in a web of calculated betrayal. The political machinations that propelled Jane to the throne were as swift as they were ruthless. Upon the death of Edward VI, the boy king whose own health was failing, factions within the court moved with cold efficiency to secure the succession in a manner that would preserve Protestant rule and circumvent the claims of Mary Tudor. Jane, pressured and coerced, was forced to accept the crown in a spectacle that bore the hallmarks of theatricality rather than genuine sovereignty. Her acceptance was less an act of agency and more a submission to the inexorable tides of Tudor power struggles. Imprisonment followed swiftly. The Tower of London, a grim fortress synonymous with state-sanctioned death and despair, became Jane's final refuge. Within its cold stone walls, the young queen was stripped of any vestige of authority, reduced to a symbol of political expediency and a target for Mary's retributive justice. The psychological toll of this confinement, compounded by the knowledge of her precarious fate, must have been immense. Isolated, betrayed, and facing the inexorable machinery of death, Jane's plight encapsulated the systematic unmaking of a figure once poised to rule. The execution itself was a grim tableau of Tudor theatrical cruelty. On the scaffold erected within the Tower grounds, the machinery of death awaited with cold precision. The starkness of the setting, a brief stage for a calculated political spectacle, underscored the brutal finality of Jane's downfall. Her composure in those final moments, however, defied the cruelty imposed upon her. In a brief yet poignant speech, she maintained a dignity that transcended the grim circumstances, invoking faith and expressing a tragic acceptance of her fate. This speech, sparse yet laden with emotional and symbolic weight, crystallized her transformation from a political pawn to a figure of tragic nobility. Jane's final address to the crowd was not mere rhetoric, but an act of psychological resistance. "I am the Queen of England as well as you," she declared, asserting a claim to legitimacy even in the face of impending death. Her words, simple yet profound, illuminated the stark contrast between the innocence of a young woman and the merciless political forces arrayed against her. The execution was not merely the end of a life, but a public spectacle designed to erase her claim and solidify the ascendance of Mary I. The image of Lady Jane Grey on the scaffold, calm, resolute, and dignified, stands in haunting contrast to the violence that claimed her life. It is a tableau of psychological torture rendered visible, a moment where individual humanity confronts the systematic cruelty of Tudor statecraft. The act of execution was choreographed with calculated theatricality, transforming death into a political statement intended to convey both warning and triumph. In recounting the grim conditions of Jane's final hours, one notes the cold efficiency that characterized her removal from the world. The Tower, a place where walls have witnessed countless betrayals, served as the backdrop for a death that was as much about public humiliation as it was about eliminating a rival. The crowd that gathered was a mixture of curiosity, sympathy, and political fervor, an audience to a spectacle that underscored the deadly stakes of Tudor succession. The psychological dismantling of Lady Jane Grey began long before the blade fell. The forced abdication of her agency, the isolation within prison walls, and the public exposure of her vulnerability combined to create a crucible of suffering. Yet, Her final moments revealed a remarkable resilience, a fleeting assertion of identity and faith that challenged the narrative imposed by her executioners. This duality, the victimhood imposed by political cruelty and the personal dignity maintained in the face of death, renders her story both harrowing and profoundly human. Thus, the 9 days of Lady Jane Grey's reign were marked not only by political intrigue, but by an unfolding tragedy that illuminated the darker recesses of power. The young queen's brief tenure was less a chapter of sovereign rule than a prelude to a calculated downfall, orchestrated to serve the ambitions of others. Her execution at the Tower was simultaneously an act of state-sanctioned violence and a psychological spectacle, designed to extinguish acclaim and deter dissent. It remains a grim reminder of the human cost embedded within the brutal calculus of Tudor politics. The immediate aftermath of Lady Jane Grey's execution was as swift and unyielding as the act itself. With her death, the tenuous thread of her claim to the English throne was severed, allowing Mary I to reclaim her birthright and impose her will upon a kingdom already fractured by religious and dynastic strife. The finality of Jane's demise did not merely mark the end of a life. It signaled the extinguishing of a political threat that had loomed, however briefly, over Mary's ascendant reign. The execution was a calculated act of statecraft, an unambiguous assertion of dominance intended to quash any residual dissent and to restore a fragile order. Yet, the erasure of Lady Jane Grey's legacy did not end with her death. Subsequent regimes engaged in a systematic manipulation of her memory, recasting her image to fit shifting political narratives. In some accounts, she was portrayed as a mere pawn, a hapless victim caught in the crossfire of larger forces beyond her control. In others, her youthful innocence was romanticized, transforming her into a tragic figure whose brief sovereignty was a cruel historical footnote. This deliberate obfuscation served to sanitize the brutality of her execution, obscuring the cruel psychological torture she endured and the cold calculations that had condemned her. Within the claustrophobic confines of the Tower, the psychological torment that Lady Jane Grey suffered was profound and relentless. Isolated from the world she had momentarily ruled, she was subjected to a form of captivity that was both physical and mental. The weight of betrayal, by those who had crowned her and then abandoned her, must have been crushing. At an age when most seek to forge their own identities, Jane found her life stripped of autonomy, her fate dictated by the merciless ambitions of others. The walls of the Tower echoed with the silence of a youthful spirit crushed beneath the machinery of political expediency. The impact of Jane's death extended beyond her own suffering, casting a long shadow over her family and supporters. Those who had aligned themselves with her cause found themselves tainted by association, subjected to disgrace, persecution, and the swift retribution of a regime eager to consolidate power. The reverberations of her execution disrupted social and political networks, instilling fear and reinforcing the perilous nature of Tudor loyalty. In this way, her death was not an isolated tragedy, but a catalyst for a broader climate of intimidation and control. The day of the execution itself was marked by a chilling atmosphere, a public spectacle orchestrated to demonstrate the ruthless authority of the state. The scaffold within the Tower grounds was more than a mere platform for death. It was a stage upon which political messages were broadcast with stark clarity. The crowd that assembled was a heterogeneous mix of curiosity, fear, and political allegiance, bearing witness to an event designed to shock and subdue. Public humiliation was as much a weapon as the executioner's axe. The spectacle aimed at dismantling not only Jane's body, but the very idea of her claim. This atmosphere of spectacle and terror was compounded by the psychological torture inherent in the public nature of the execution. For Lady Jane Grey, the ordeal was not solely the physical agony that awaited her, but the systematic stripping away of dignity before an audience whose sympathies were uncertain and whose loyalties were volatile. The execution was a performance of power, a calculated display meant to reinforce the dominance of Mary's regime and to signal the fate awaiting any who would challenge it. The psychological dimensions of this public humiliation cannot be overstated. The deliberate exposure of a young woman, condemned to death for a crime she had been compelled to commit, served as a form of state-sponsored cruelty that extended far beyond the moment of her death. This spectacle was designed to fracture her identity, to erase her from the collective memory as a legitimate claimant, and to redefine her as a cautionary symbol of failed ambition. In this, the execution was as much an act of psychological torture as it was of physical violence. Behind the veneer of political necessity lay a profound human tragedy. The systematic dismantling of Lady Jane Grey's life and legacy reveals the darker undercurrents of Tudor power, where innocence was exploited, youth was sacrificed, and the machinery of state operated with ruthless efficiency to extinguish threats without hesitation. Jane's story is a stark reminder of the human cost embedded within political ambition, where the boundaries between victim and pawn blur in the shadow of calculated cruelty. The psychological torment experienced by Jane during her imprisonment and final days exemplifies the destructive impact of political betrayal at a tender age. The isolation imposed by her captors was not merely a measure of security, but a tool of mental subjugation, designed to break her spirit and sever her from any remaining sources of support or hope. The knowledge that those who had once elevated her to sovereignty had abandoned her to death must have inflicted a profound sense of abandonment and despair. This psychological dismantling, while less visible than the physical act of execution, was no less brutal. The repercussions of her death radiated through the Tudor court and beyond, a chilling reminder of the perilous nature of power. Those who had supported Jane faced their own reckonings, caught in the crosshairs of political vengeance. The swift and unforgiving purge of her allies served as a grim warning to others, reinforcing the message that loyalty to a fallen cause was tantamount to complicity in treason. In this climate, fear became a tool as potent as the executioner's blade. The public's reaction to Jane's execution was complex and fraught with ambiguity. While some viewed the execution as a necessary act of justice, others were moved by the tragedy of a young woman condemned by forces beyond her control. This tension within the crowd mirrored the broader societal divisions that marked Mary's reign, where religious and political loyalties were contested with ferocity. The spectacle of Jane's death thus became a focal point for these conflicts, encapsulating the volatile intersection of personal tragedy and public spectacle. In sum, the day of Lady Jane Grey's execution was a calculated spectacle of state power, designed to achieve multiple ends: to eliminate a rival, to manipulate public perception, and to inflict psychological devastation on both the victim and her supporters. This orchestrated event laid bare the ruthless nature of Tudor political culture, where human lives were expendable instruments in the pursuit of authority. The legacy of this execution, obscured and reshaped by subsequent narratives, nonetheless bears the indelible marks of psychological torture and public humiliation, underscoring the profound costs of dynastic ambition. Lady Jane Grey's execution was not merely a tragic end to a youthful life, but a meticulously calculated political act, designed with ruthless precision to consolidate the legitimacy of Mary I's reign and to eliminate any vestiges of rivalry. This event, far from being an isolated incident, epitomized the brutal realpolitik that characterized Tudor succession struggles, a landscape where human lives were subordinated to dynastic imperatives, and where execution served as both punishment and political theater. The methodical orchestration of Jane's downfall exemplifies the cold calculus employed by Mary and her advisors to secure their fragile hold on power. This calculated elimination of Jane was emblematic of a broader pattern of ruthless statecraft evident throughout history, where figures embodying contested claims or inconvenient truths were systematically neutralized. Jane, in this context, was a scapegoat fashioned by the exigencies of Tudor politics, her youthful innocence exploited and then discarded to serve the ambitions of others. This dynamic echoes the fates of numerous historical figures who, caught in the crosshairs of power struggles, became victims of public character assassination and state-sanctioned erasure. Historical narratives surrounding Lady Jane Grey have undergone significant transformations, reflecting the shifting political and cultural landscapes through which her story has been told. Early accounts often sanitized the brutal circumstances of her execution, emphasizing her role as the 9 Days Queen and framing her as a tragic, almost romantic figure. Such portrayals, while eliciting sympathy, risk obscuring the calculated cruelty that underpinned her demise. The romanticization of Jane's story serves to soften the harsh realities of Tudor political violence, replacing stark historical truth with a more palatable mythos. From a psychological perspective, Jane's story unveils profound themes of innocence manipulated and destroyed by the insatiable ambitions of those around her. Her youth and education, qualities that should have protected or empowered her, instead rendered her susceptible to manipulation and instrumentalization. The psychological toll of being thrust into a role fraught with mortal danger, with limited agency, and surrounded by duplicity, speaks to the tragic cost of dynastic ambition. The execution was not solely a physical act of death, but a symbolic extinguishing of a personhood shaped and shattered by political forces beyond her control. The psychological dimensions of Jane's downfall extend beyond her own experience to illuminate broader mechanisms of state power. The execution functioned as a form of public spectacle, a calculated display of authority designed to instill fear, assert dominance, and rewrite legitimacy. This systematic theatricality of power exposes the intersection of psychological torture and political necessity, where the body of the condemned becomes a canvas upon which state narratives are inscribed and disseminated. Jane's execution also holds a lasting place within the Tudor succession's fraught legacy. It underscored the lethal stakes of monarchy, where youthful sacrifice became a currency of political survival. Her death was a grim punctuation mark in the ongoing narrative of religious upheaval and dynastic conflict that defined the era. The symbolic weight of her execution reverberated beyond the immediate political context, shaping perceptions of legitimacy, power, and martyrdom within the turbulent Tudor epoch. In considering the enduring legacy of Lady Jane Grey's execution, one observes its function as a cautionary emblem, an enduring symbol of the deadly intersections between innocence, ambition, and political cruelty. Her story compels a reckoning with the human cost of monarchical power struggles and the ways in which state violence is both enacted and remembered. The psychological trauma embedded in her narrative challenges sanitized historical accounts and demands acknowledgement of the brutal realities masked by legend. Thus, the execution of Lady Jane Grey transcends its immediate historical moment to offer insights into the mechanisms of political violence and psychological dismantling that define regimes seeking to consolidate power. Her story, marked by innocence betrayed and identity obliterated, serves as a somber reflection on the calculated theatricality of death within Tudor politics. It is a reminder that behind the sanitized pages of history lie narratives of suffering, manipulation, and the systematic unmaking of individuals sacrificed at the altar of dynastic ambition. If you love the story, like the video and subscribe.